There is a row of shallow caves carved into a cliff face in the high desert of south-central Oregon, in a remote stretch of land most Americans could not find on a map. For decades, researchers knew these caves existed. They visited them, noted them in field records, and moved on. Nobody dug deep enough. Nobody thought it was necessary. The story of how humans first arrived in the Americas had already been written, agreed upon, taught in every school, and framed in every museum. What was the point of looking harder at a dusty cave in the Oregon outback? Then, in the summer of 2007, a field team from the University of Oregon went back to those caves with better tools, better methods, and a willingness to dig deeper than anyone had gone before. What they pulled out of the earth was not a weapon, not a carved ornament, not anything that would look impressive behind glass. It was the most ordinary thing a human body can leave behind. And it carried inside it a date that stopped the entire field of archaeology cold. Because according to every test the scientists could run, people were standing in that Oregon cave more than 1,000 years before the textbook said any human being had set foot on this continent at all. The caves are called the Paisley Caves, a cluster of dry rock shelters in Lake County, Oregon, in the high desert country north of the California border. The site had first been investigated in the 1930s by Luther Cressman, the founding father of Oregon archaeology, who found a woven sandal there that was thousands of years old. But the layers that would eventually upend the story of human origins lay deeper than Cressman ever reached. It took until 2007, when senior archaeologist Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History led his team back to Paisley for those deeper layers to finally give up what they had been holding. What Jenkins's team recovered was a series of coprolites, preserved, fossilized human feces, dried by the desert air and sealed in the cave sediments for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The desert conditions of the high Oregon Plateau had done something no laboratory can replicate. DNA from dried human excrement recovered from Oregon's Paisley Caves turned out to be the oldest found yet in the New World, dating to 14,300 years ago, some 1,200 years before Clovis culture, according to an international team of 13 scientists. The mitochondrial DNA extracted from those samples matched haplogroups that tied directly to the founding populations of Native America. This was not the genetic signature of a failed migration that arrived and died without issue. It was the direct ancestral lineage of indigenous people who are alive today. NBC Los Angeles. But the DNA alone was not enough for some critics. DNA has been shown to be mobile in sediments in a range of environments and is also relatively easy to degrade. And because the polymerase chain reaction method amplifies vanishingly low amounts of DNA, such analyses are particularly prone to contamination. Skeptics argued that ancient DNA evidence could have been introduced into the sediment layers long after the coprolites were deposited. It was a legitimate scientific challenge, and the researchers at Paisley faced it directly. When some questioned the attribution as human of the coprolites, DNA studies confirmed the source. When some questioned the accuracy of the DNA findings, scientists pursued novel approaches to confirm them. WikipediaGeo.tv. That novel approach came from a team led by Lisa Marie Shalito of Newcastle University, who applied a completely different analytical method to the Paisley material. Using fecal lipid biomarkers, specifically bile acids and 5-beta-stanols, researchers demonstrated unequivocally that 3 coprolites dated to pre-Clovis age were human. These biomarkers carry a substantial advantage over DNA in that they are hydrophobic and therefore unlikely to move within the stratigraphy of a sedimentary profile and are highly recalcitrant, far more so than DNA. In plain language, these chemical signatures cannot migrate through soil the way DNA can. They stay exactly where they were deposited, which means they stay exactly as old as the layer they were found in. The date held. Humans were in Oregon more than 14,000 years ago. Wikipedia. Researchers also found artifacts at the site that included western-stemmed projectile points and woven plant fiber cordage. A fragment of that cordage was directly radiocarbon dated. The fragment was dated to roughly 14,000 years before present, giving a direct radiocarbon age on a pre-Clovis cultural artifact, and confirming the stratigraphic integrity of the cave sediments. Between the biomarker chemistry, the DNA, the stone tools, and the directly dated organic artifact, Paisley Caves had built an evidence base that covered every angle of attack a skeptic could throw at it. imdbgo.tv. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what it breaks. For most of the 20th century, a single model dominated the field. The first humans to enter the Americas were the Clovis people, named for a site in New Mexico where distinctive fluted stone spear points were first identified in the 1930s. The story held that these people crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska roughly 13,000 years ago, found an ice-free corridor through the glaciers, and spread rapidly across an empty continent. It was a clean and teachable story. It also gave a specific date and a specific route. 13,000 years ago, one door, one direction. Paisley put 14,300-year-old human DNA on the wrong side of that wall. The Clovis people were not first, and the Oregon Desert had already known that for thousands of years. But Paisley was not the only site in Oregon carrying this message. 70 miles to the north, in Harney County, outside the town of Riley, a second site had been slowly, patiently building a parallel case since 2011. This one did not offer DNA. It offered something in some ways even more powerful, a clock that no one could argue with. The site is called Rimrock Drawrock Shelter, a basalt overhang along a dry stream channel in the Oregon High Desert. University of Oregon archaeologist Patrick O'Grady has been leading excavations there since 2011 under a partnership agreement with the Bureau of Land Management, and the site has produced what may be the oldest stone tool west of the Rocky Mountains. The excavation work is exactly the kind of archaeology that never makes a documentary. Slow, methodical, brush and screen work conducted across season after season with no guarantee of a dramatic conclusion. ResearchGate. The discovery that changed everything at Rimrock Draw came in 2012. O'Grady's team, digging down through the layered sediments of the shelter floor, encountered something that established an absolute chronological boundary for the site. Among the remarkable discoveries were finely crafted stone tools, including scrapers made of chalcedony, one of which still bore traces of bison blood. These tools were found beneath layers of volcanic ash from a Mount St. Helens eruption dated to 15,300 to 15,600 years ago, suggesting the artifacts are even older. A volcanic ash layer of this kind is not an ordinary piece of evidence. It is an immovable chronological marker. The eruption happened once on a specific date, and the ash fell across the landscape and settled into the soil. Everything above that ash layer is younger than the eruption. Everything below it is older. There is no wiggle room, no possibility of contamination, no argument about sample migration through the sediment. A volcano drew a line in the dirt more than 15,000 years ago, and whatever lay below that line was already ancient when the ash fell. Below that line, at Rimrock Draw, the team found stone tools. And below the tools, they found bones. In 2012, O'Grady's team found camel teeth fragments under the layer of volcanic ash. Further excavation revealed tooth fragments from extinct Pleistocene mammals, including camels and bison. These were not animals from recent centuries. The camelops and bison antiquus that roamed the Oregon High Desert during the last ice age went extinct thousands of years ago. Their presence in the sediment below the volcanic ash layer confirmed that the tools and the animals occupied the same ancient world. All that's interesting. Additional testing of the camel and bison teeth fragments yielded radiocarbon dates as old as 18,300 years before present. The natural layering of the rock shelter sediments suggests the scrapers are older than both the volcanic ash and the camel teeth. The identification of 15,000-year-old volcanic ash was a shock, O'Grady said. Then the 18,000-year-old dates on the enamel, with stone tools and flakes below, were even more startling. Phys.org/EBSCO. The tools themselves told an additional story that deepened the significance of the date. The scrapers recovered at Rimrock Draw belong to what researchers call the Western stem tradition. Long blades with rounded bases that look nothing like the fluted Clovis points everyone had previously assumed were the oldest technology on the continent. The Western stem tradition is the oldest non-fluted lithic technology in the American Far West, and sites like Paisley Caves provide evidence that Western STEM technology predates Clovis, establishing it as the oldest well-defined technological tradition in North America, with links to late Pleistocene sites in East Asia and Siberia. That last detail is the thread that ties Oregon to a much larger picture, a tradition of stone toolmaking that looks nothing like Clovis, that predates Clovis by thousands of years, and that shares technical characteristics with sites in East Asia and Siberia, does not fit inside the old story of one migration through one ice-free corridor. It implies something more complicated, more ancient, and more geographically diverse than the textbook had ever entertained. While Oregon's two sites were building their case from the west, a discovery in New Mexico had been simultaneously forcing the same reckoning from a completely different angle. At White Sands National Park, in the pale gypsum dunes of southern New Mexico, ancient human footprints had been pressing into hardened lake sediment for tens of thousands of years, waiting for someone to walk across them. They were found in 2019 and reported in 2021. The dates that came back initially were almost impossible to accept. Ancient human footprints discovered in White Sands National Park were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, a discovery that pushed the known date of human presence in North America back by thousands of years and implied that early inhabitants and megafauna coexisted for several millennia before the terminal Pleistocene extinction event. TikTok. The immediate reaction from parts of the archaeological community was skepticism. Critics raised a legitimate objection about whether the aquatic plant seeds used for the initial radiocarbon dating might have absorbed old carbon from groundwater, making them appear falsely ancient. It was the kind of challenge good science is designed to survive. In a follow-up study published in Science, researchers used two new independent approaches to date the footprints, both of which resulted in the same age range as the original estimate. Then, in June 2025, a third study published in Science Advances provided yet another line of confirmation. A newly published study in Science Advances provided the strongest evidence to date that the tracks found at White Sands are approximately 23,000 years old. 3 independent sources, seeds, pollen, and mud, each tested separately, all landed in the same window, the height of the last ice age, exactly when the textbook maintains North America was empty. TikTok IMDb. Those footprints show that human activity occurred in the Americas as long as 23,000 years ago, about 10,000 years earlier than previously thought. They are not abstract. They are not the kind of evidence you interpret through theory or inference. You can see the toes. You can see the curve of the arch. Some belong to children. Others belong to adults moving at speed. They walked along the edge of an Ice Age lake alongside Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, at a moment when the corridor through the glaciers that the old model required had not yet opened. They could not have arrived through the door the textbook described, because that door was not open. Screen rant. What Oregon revealed, when taken alongside White Sands and the growing body of evidence accumulating across the continent, is not a small correction to a well-established story. It is the dismantling of that story at its foundations. The Clovis people were not first. The land bridge corridor was not the only route, and perhaps not even the primary one. People were here far earlier, arriving by means and along pathways that the old model never accounted for. It's not so much that we have such old dates, but that we're getting consistent results, O'Grady said of the Rimrock draw evidence. This site is beautiful in that sense because for the past 11 years, we're actually seeing something that's preserved through time that dates from about 7,000 years back to 18,000. And that's magic. EBSCO. That word, magic, is not the language of scientific overconfidence. It is the language of a researcher who has spent more than a decade on his knees in the Oregon desert, watching the layers of time give up their secrets one careful brushstroke at a time, and who has come to understand that the ground beneath that high desert is carrying something far older and far stranger than anyone was prepared to find. The first Americans were not who we were told. They did not arrive when we were told. And somewhere in the dry caves and wind-swept rock shelters of the Oregon outback, the proof has been waiting for